You guys seem to have it all like good.
Let me grab you closer. Let me show you too much. You find yourself in paradise. Someone up there and see your breath. Blood red wine is on the house. Red and the bones are free. We invite you to spend your every night. You don't have much choice. You'll be seeing a lot of. Go on, spit apart the floor. Drink this night. Tear each other apart, so everything is your plan. I'm only here to serve. You're everyone's whim. Call me, have a talk. Body by the bar, I'm gonna work really nice. So please agree, it's time here for. Beyond just entertainment, whilst you wait for the next sentence. The piano man who'll play the Lord. Don't think it's for your pleasure. Treat him as you wish, you can treat him as you like. Well, I'll be pleasure. Go on, spit upon the floor. Drink the night away. Tear each other apart, sir. Everything is your praise. I am only here to serve everyone of your will. Only heaven's hopes, by the I'm gonna watch your eyes. Only heaven's hopes, by the I'm gonna watch your eyes. Only heaven's hopes, by the to open your eyes. Walked in here after 30 miles, swagged in prison style, making moans and them dirty feet. Need a bed and for something to eat. Played for you and I played it right. Sang in tune and I danced all night. Look to you as the only one. Didn't know it would come undone. But I hit the road when I was 15. When my mama died and my daddy got me. Now I've been locked up since 21. Now it's my mother, only son. Got him up every day. She used to say, little boy, you're my pride and joy. You're the only good thing here about all fits wrong. Now I feel the world rushing down around me. Makes me lonely, I tell myself. I've been drinking all the wrong things I know. And now what am I gonna do to survive this life? Got much from those early days. Remember what she said. Little boy, I'm a pride and joy. You're the only good thing here about all this world. Little boy, I'm a pride and joy. Only good thing here about all this world. She said, little boy, you're my pride and joy. You're the only good thing here about all this world. Maybe I'm not over the complete. Where you keep me dangling. Every time I'm ready, I can walk away. So clear that my thought with the perfect thing to say. I've been waiting on that light, swing on by. When the my phone is about if for about 5 minutes and now you wanna say goodbye, no. I need it all night long, so baby, maybe you should swing on back. Friends call me a fool, say I should free myself from these chains. I don't know what else I do. Now your pictures in these frames. Baby, I just wait and I wait till the day my dreams come true. No more. Show me at my doorstep, baby, I love you too. I've been waiting on that one. Swing on back. Waiting on the phone, it's about to take. If for about 5 minutes and now you wanna say goodbye, no more. I'm sure you're not home, so baby, maybe you should swing on back. I've been waiting on that long time. Waiting on the phone, it's about to if for about 5 minutes and now you wanna say goodbye, no more. I'm here all night long, so baby, maybe you should sing all back. I'm here all night long, maybe you should sing all back.
She was amazing. She was, I mean, I know
Hi everyone, we might get started now if that's all right. My name's Lillian Ireland. I'm a proud Malakadi woman from Lutruwita, Tasmania. Ya, Nanoi, Tutawatawiana, Narawa, Winhani Manina, Lualuna, Liogana. Come, this is my hand. Feel the earth on solar foot. We run together, friend. These are the words of my language by Tony Murray. I'm an ANU Law and Science student and have briefly seen the ACT justice system through experience at the Aboriginal Legal Service in the ACT's Magistrate and Supreme Courts, and I've also worked at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. I'm honoured to be here today for such a vital discussion and amongst such incredible leaders. I want to thank Paul House for the welcome to the beautiful Ngunnawal Ngambri country that we're on today, and I extend that acknowledgement to the custodians of all lands and waters across this continent, and pay my respects to all First Nations people here today, carrying the strength and wisdom of their ancestors. The film we've all just witnessed lays bare to the injustice taking place across Australia. We, the ACT, as the capital, we should be leading the change, but we're failing horrendously. Even though the ACT has some of the lowest imprisonment rates in the country, when it comes to mob, it's one of the most severely penalising jurisdictions. In our jail, 1 in 4 people are Indigenous. Per capita, this is the highest rate in the country. According to the most recent statistics, 89% of Indigenous prisoners enter the ACT custody unsentenced, and once in the system face a vicious cycle, with 94% of having been to prison before, compared to 74% for non-Indigenous prisoners. These rates, again, are the worst in the country. Our mob are not innately criminal. Last year, 27% of Indigenous prisoners in the ACT were in jail with their worst offence being what is classified as justice procedure offences, which is like breach of bail. Our youth are taken away here at rates worse than ever, and this can't be because we have no love for them. And the Indigenous child in the ACT is 9 times more likely to be in out-of-home care, a rate second only to the Northern Territory. These are not statistics, these are people. And what is happening to our people in our capital is not only abhorrent, but proof that the justice system's not working. Today, we have a panel of truly phenomenal First Nations people who've dedicated their lives to pursuing a just justice system, especially in the ACT, and whose wisdom can lead us and the rest of Australia into a better future. Firstly, we have the incredible Leah House. Leah's a Ngunnawal Ngambri graduate woman. She's been living, working and raising her children on ancestral lands, and she's currently an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Victims Liaison Officer at Victims of Crime ACT. Passionate about access to justice and cultural strength, Leah was awarded ACT Public Education Volunteer of the Year in 2018. Leah supported Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in the justice system through the Alexander McConaughey Centre and the Women's Legal Centre. Leah has long worked in the community and government to address domestic and family violence, and is also a proud advocate and dedicated supporter of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Secondly, we're honoured to have Professor Tom Calma, a Gungaran elder and Iwaja man who, since the 1980s, has been instrumental in Indigenous education and human rights. Tom has served as a senior diplomat, a senior ministerial advisor, the Race Discrimination Commissioner, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Tom is the Chancellor of the University of Canberra and was the second Indigenous person to be appointed as a Chancellor of an Australian university. Tom is also currently a professor at the University of Sydney and National Coordinator for Tackling Indigenous Smoking. From laying the foundation of closing the gap, being awarded an Order of Australia Medal in 2012, receiving the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Flag in 2016, and being part and chairing a litany of bodies leading change for First Nations people, Professor Calma has worked tirelessly for social justice. Last but certainly not least, we have Magistrate Louise Taylor, a proud Gamilaroi woman. Louise was the 8th permanent magistrate on the ACT Magistrates Court and is the ACT's first Aboriginal judicial officer, and who I've had the absolute pleasure of briefly being her associate. Louise has worked for the Commonwealth and ACT Director of Public Prosecutions and was also previously the Deputy CEO of Legal Aid ACT. Louise has spent significant periods as chair of the Women's Legal Centre in ACT and has been a member and chair of numerous councils and committees to promote access to justice for women. For her work, Louise has been awarded the 2009 ACT International Women's Day Award, and it was the 2019 recipient of Indigenous Alumna of the Year Award at ANU. We are really honoured to have you all here with us today. I guess to start off with, having seen the film, it's all really heavy. How are you feeling about it?
Well, I'll go first. It's not the first time I've seen it, but each time it provokes anger. Is I guess the first reaction, and then sadness. Really, that things just haven't changed, but also a feeling of real pride at those Indigenous advocates who are out there presenting their stories and talking about the issues. And it's something we can be very proud of. And I think what really buoys me on is that we can all be agents of change if we want to put our mind to it and become informed about these issues. But it's so sad that as the years progress, there seems to be no progress in all these issues, and we just have to look at ways to have interventions to make a change.
Anyone else want to add on that?
I didn't sit and watch it just now, but I've seen the film a couple of times, but I chose not to expose myself before this panel to that trauma. But like a few people in the audience right now, we actually see this day in, day out. So we are exposed to this reality and it takes its toll. And I haven't watched that footage without crying. So every time I've seen it, and I've seen the footage of Tanya or Dylan or David, I've got his badge here. I wear this almost daily, his badge. I see, because this footage is played out so frequently on social media and on mainstream media, it's hard not to see the mob here in the ACT that I work with. When I see that footage of Auntie Tanya on the ground, or when I see them young fellas in that detention centre up at Dondale, I cannot watch that without drawing that directly to what I see here in the ACT. But I also think that the footage, the film you've all just watched, actually only scrapes the surface of what the reality is. I think the film itself does a brilliant job. It evokes emotions, but it's actually only scraping the surface. And that's actually the footage you've just watched is actually quite palatable compared to the reality that First Nations mob across this continent deal with day in, day out, and have done so for the last 250 plus years since colonisation of the continent.
Yeah, I guess building on that, Leah, sorry to throw it back to you, but you've worked in the community in this area for quite a while. What do you see as the key factors here that are causing mob to have contact with the justice system?
I should have been prepared for this question, and I'm going to apologise straight away because I'm a terrible public speaker. So I don't know why I keep agreeing to this. There's public speaking opportunities, but I do bring it back to I can speak as myself individually in what I see in my community, and I can speak from first-hand experience with my contact with the justice system as a youth and my family members and the loss of family members in my direct family at the hands of colonial structures like the justice system. So I do want to start with, I don't actually speak for all mob. No, none of us can speak for all mob and experiences. The question was...
What are the key factors that are causing the initial contact to come into the justice system?
I do bring it directly back to birth. We know that our women are targeted by care protection. Women are intercepted during their pregnancy. We know ACT has the highest notification rates to CYPS, and we know ACT comes second in child removals and out-of-home care. We're not just pulling that out of thin air. These are stats. We're all aware of it. So I do very much believe that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are targeted from the moment of conception. They have a target on their back from the moment they're born. And our babies, our young, particularly young men, are being demonized from such early ages. And I see that it starts at birth, it starts at conception, and they're coming in contact because services that are meant to be here to support our communities are failing at every step of the way. That's my opinion. I do see failures at every level from the ground up, because I don't think we'd still be sitting here in 2022 and having to, I don't think at my age I should have to be having this conversation when generations before me have been screaming this every step of the way. This isn't a new conversation. These conversations are repeated, and it's appalling that my generation now has to pick up this fight and repeat what our elders have been fighting for generations. I see failures at every step of the way, and I see it within the medical space, medical neglect, that lack of access to health services. I see it within education, the education system here in the ACT. I did have a short stint working in that space, and I see failures every step of the way there. The education system doesn't teach our true history. I see it within the justice system. It fails us. I'm trying to think of a space where it's not failing First Nations people. And if anyone has any, feel free to shout it out. But I can't think of a single space that Black bodies are coming in contact with within this colonial structure that is Australia, where we are not being failed, except for the spaces that are held by Black bodies, like those grassroots mob, like those services that are Black controlled. So not to discredit any of the work those mob do, because they are on the ground doing that hard work. But look at Wananga, look at the roadblocks and the barriers that they're given every step of the way, and that pushback from systems like AMC, that pushback to actually get in there and do the work that needs to be done. It almost feels like, does this country want First Nations people to truly progress? And I mean, reconciliation is preached, but how far have we actually come? I know personally I can't sit through another land acknowledgement. I refuse to sit through land acknowledgements. If it's not going to result in land back, then don't waste your time. Stop wasting. Why are we acknowledging this is First Nations land? when you've got no intention of returning it, it's not even an option to return it realistically. Like where we're told we'll go live out bush and, you know, go hunt your food and all that, go back to bush. And it's like, well, you know what, this is my ancestral country right here, where your colonial structures are built, where they sit. This is my ancestral land. This is my great-great-great-grandfather's country. So when you tell me to go back and go out bush, I can't. That's not an option. And it's not an option for a lot of mob. It's very high school, that clap back.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but
all good rambles though. I guess building on that, Louise, you see it from a different angle right now in your current profession. So what are the results of the system biases you see in the high number of Indigenous incarceration in the ACT, from policing to sentence?
The results are the continued dysfunction that we see in our communities. On the way here, I was reflecting on that question, knowing you might throw it to me. It occurred to me that one of the major results of that is an absence of joy and happiness from the lives of many of our mob. I see a lot of our people at crisis points, and those folks are often lurching from one crisis to the other in their life, and that's an awful way to live your life. It's a way of living that a lot of Australian people wouldn't have much experience of, but sadly for many of our folks, they do have incredible experience of that. And listening to Leah's answer, where she said it's quite a profound question actually, whether Australia wants our people to progress at all, because when you hear Tom's reflection that the film caused him to wonder about the progress that isn't progress at all. And then you reflect on the number of reports and consultations that we have as a people participated in for years. And then we're still asked the question, how do we solve this awful problem of Indigenous incarceration? And the blueprints are there. The answers are there. If you go back to the Royal Commission, it comes back to one of the things that Leah touched upon, which is self-determination. And the Royal Commission made it clear that keeping us safe in these systems was a difficult prospect, that the way to keep us safe is to keep us out of that system. And I do worry sometimes that the focus on the criminal justice system as that system responsible for how we end up so overrepresented in incarceration numbers from a sort of point A to point B, yes, that is the reason, but it's naive to ignore the role that care and protection plays in that very linear pathway. For many of our young people, their destinies are sealed, sadly, once the care and protection system has a hold of them. And you can track the pathway sometimes of the young people that we see, sadly knowing that you will see them in the care and protection space, then in the youth justice space, and very soon in the adult offending space. And it also occurs to me, and perhaps some of you might think this is a bit of a cop-out, but the criminal justice system is asked to do a lot, to solve a lot of the problem of the lives of the people that we see. And very often we are ill-equipped and underfunded to do that. We are asked to be experts in a whole range of things that we're inexpert at. And I think as a community generally, and not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but also for the great many people that the criminal justice system deals with, the community needs to have a very honest discussion about what it wants us to achieve. Does it want us to rehabilitate people, punish people, keep people safe, brutalise people, re-traumatise people? What do we want out of that system? Because sadly, the statistics that you read aloud tell us that we're not very successful in turning people away from our doors. And yet so much of it is out of the system's control by the time we have to deal with people. So I think the results are continued dysfunction, and we keep doing things the way we've done them and expecting a different result. And that to me is absurd. So we need to have a question about what we want the criminal justice system to achieve, and then have an honest conversation about how well equipped it is to do that. and not ignore that, in my view, the rates of incarceration, the rates of children in out-of-home care are a direct reflection of the social and political position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I have no doubt about that. One wonders why First Nations people deliver the Uluru Statement to the feet of the Australian people and to the minds of politicians, and here we are years later still wringing our hands about what the solution is. And the two prongs of the Uluru Statement are child removals and incarceration. It's no shock. These are not new issues. As Leah said, as a young person, she's wondering, why am I still having this fight when the issues have been identified for years and the solutions have been out there for years? It's the political will that's required, the funding that's required, and a shift in a mindset, in my view, about how to solve some of these problems.
I think
Add to that.
of course.
I reckon mob here in Australia have to be the most researched people in the world, because the amount of work at our fingertips on Google, the amount of recommendations, reports that have been made, the Royal Commissions, it is incredible that we are still being asked, what can we do? How can we fix this? It's there. Mob have been saying it. It's a little bit silly at this point, the repetition of it, but the Alexander McConaughey Centre is housing traumatised and marginalised First Nations men and women, and Bimbury's holding our babies. And they are not equipping them to reintegrate back into community. We know that because the recidivism rates, I can never pronounce that word, but the rates, recidivism rates would not be what we see right now. So, you know, like what do they think they're releasing them to? It's because they've criminalized human beings. They have criminalized poverty, they've criminalized homelessness, they've criminalized mental health. All of these issues, exactly what Lou was just saying, that what is expected to be sorted out within the criminal justice system, it doesn't belong there. This society, this country has criminalized people that just need help. And there's no excuse for it.
Yeah, I guess we've known a while what the solutions are to these old problems that are just still playing out. And Tom, I wonder if you have anything to say. We have these solutions, and we have here in the ACT elders and community on the ground that know what to do, but there just has been that gap and disconnect between what's adopted and the policies. Do you have any explanation of what that could be? What's that gap?
I think by the time it gets into the criminal justice system, that's the end point, and it's all that leads up to why people get incarcerated. And if we look at the number of people who are incarcerated, not only here but nationally, a very high proportion are on remand, and we haven't addressed those issues that brought them in the first place. Very high numbers of people are homeless. They have other health conditions, both mental health and physical health conditions that aren't being addressed. They may have addictions that haven't been addressed, and they get put into a system where they're expected to go cold turkey or whatever without any of the support. Leah mentioned, you know, the issues that Woononga have of trying to get access to, you know, and they've got a formal agreement with the justice system to be able to enter, and yet they don't have the support when they front up with their medical people to be able to get through the system. So, you know, there's so many issues. There was a reference in there to the Pathways to Justice report, and Judge Myers he ended up leading that report. But you know, the background to that is that George Brandis, when he was the Attorney General, briefed the Australian Law Reform Commission to address Indigenous incarceration. Very clearly, what he said was that he didn't want to go out and do more consultations, but to have a look at all the reports that have been done, from the Royal Commission to the coronial reports, coroner's reports, to the reports that I and my predecessors as social justice commissioners had done, and come up with what we can pick out of that as the I guess the successes, and provide that advice to the government. I was part of that process with Mick Gooder was there, and was one of them, and a whole lot of very strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocates. And that report, we were given 6 months to do it, or the Law Reform Commission was. We did that report and tabled it in time in December 2017, and it still hasn't been addressed. And from our point of view, the solutions are in there.
And I commend it to people. It has a great many practical solutions for this Indigenous incarceration problem. And Leah's point about the constant return to our community with the hand-wringing that goes with it, whatever can we do, is just disingenuous in 2022 when folks like yourself and others, Tom, and a great number of strong, clever Aboriginal people have tried to and have successfully answered this question for decades, and still we're asked the question. It's offensive.
It is. And I think often we'll lay blame towards the prison system or the judiciary, but it comes back much further, and for me, it rests with the politicians. And we're going to see it again now that we've got a federal election coming up. It's going to be hard on crime, and you'll get all these lads out there, mainly lads, pressing, the hard agenda, whereas what we should be saying to them, both the government and opposition, is that address that report. The solutions are there. It's a very collective report, and it's coming from, the viewpoint of the judiciary, the police system. They're all interviewed. Many of them have ideas about what can change, but the system retards their ability to be able to administer. And so it does rest with the politicians. And they're the ones that will determine how much money goes into justice reinvestment programs or into the social programs, the health programs, the education programs. For example, early years education, we are ranked 23 out of 26 in the OECD on investment on early years education. It's those first 3 years of education, or first 3 years of life, is when the brain develops. And when you're coming from a situation where it's overcrowded housing, all the other social issues that you confronted, health issues, mental health issues, the traumas associated with inability to be able to maintain contact with land and culture and language, all of these things were taken away. And it's what Helen Milroy, our first Indigenous psychiatrist, said. This is post-traumatic stress disorder. That's been Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people have been subjected to, and we just don't get them addressed. The mental health, it is shocking to see the number of inmates who have got a mental health condition, and that's from our youth all the way through to the adults. But from a youth perspective, once they get in, and the recidivism, as has been described, the transition from youth to adult prison is so easy, and we're seeing such high numbers, going to others, as Keenan Mundine said in there. He just retold that story, and I think a lot of it, and I'd suggest that if you have a look at that film again, and you'll get more out of it the second time you see it, because you'll be able to really hear what they're saying, and as advocates, you're all advocates, and you can help make change. We've got an election coming up shortly. That's when you can really influence change.
Yeah, and I think the Pathways to Justice report you mentioned gave 35 recommendations that hasn't been responded to any government, including the ACT. There's a lot of recommendations in there, and it's a big question, but what other opportunities you see as the ones we need to focus on in the ACT as the solutions?
One of the real opportunities that's always been available to the ACT is our small geographical nature. I think we have an Aboriginal population here of around 4,000 people. It's not huge. We're not challenged by things, geographical challenges like Western Australia or the Northern Territory of New South Wales, for instance. And we also have, in my experience, a very clever and empathetic community. I think that's an enormous opportunity for the ACT to do things differently. I mean, if as a small jurisdiction we can't get this right, one wonders how any other jurisdiction could. One of the things we've all touched upon is the idea that there's this system, and I don't want my comments earlier to be taken as me sort of shrugging my shoulders and saying, well, the criminal justice system can't do it. The system is made up of individuals, and individuals, including individual judicial officers, others in positions of power, have to take responsibility for what they can as individuals do within those systems. And one of the very real problems in those systems is the absence of Aboriginal people in positions of power and influence. That's a fact. Our lives have been decided by non-Aboriginal people since Cook set foot on the East Coast, and it's not really changed. And while we as Aboriginal people have accountability within our families and our community for our individual contribution to those systems, non-Aboriginal people don't have that level of accountability. And bureaucracies across the country are full of non-Aboriginal people in senior positions making an excellent wage off the misery of our folks without too much accountability. And I think that's an enormous problem in the legal profession, in the education sector, in the health sector. There are not enough of our people at the table making decisions about how things should be done. And that's an enormous problem.
I was just going to say, whilst I'm a critic of governments, I think it's not necessarily always the government in power, but the opposition who for the sake of wanting to oppose what the government might be proposing, really does stifle advancement. And so, and I'll do a little plug of the Justice Reform Initiative that I'm a patron of, as was mentioned, and there's a number of other patrons in the room here. And as part of a national movement where we've got High Court judges, other members of the judiciary there, former attorneys generals and leaders, political leaders, and hopefully, politicians are great once they leave politics and get very brave, but and hopefully they'll be able to influence some of what we can do, including a good representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and so that's one way, and I'd say, particularly for our law students here, have a look at some of these big reports, and you don't even have to go back to the Royal Commission report, because we captured all of that in the Pathways to Justice report very succinctly, and you've got the Dondale Royal Commission, as Mick said there, great recommendations, never picked up. So many coronial inquiries and reports out there, coroner's reports, that are just sitting on the shelf. So it's there.
Leah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just the reports that have been gathering dust. I've picked up and I've been working on for the last 4 years now, the We Don't Shoot Our Wounded report and the recommendations within that, which was, I think, published in 2009. I should know that, but that sat on government shelves just collecting dust for almost a decade before, I think, Heidi, you and I were there when it got tabled at the Legislative Assembly in 2019. So it's all there. There's so much already there.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's disrespectful to the mob that put their heart and so much energy into the reports to be developed and created. It's a slap in the face to all the mob that put that energy and put that hard work in for it to go and gather dust for ACT government and for this entire nation, for all those recommendations to not be implemented, or the absolute bare minimum. What number was recommendation for reconciliation? Like, that was way down the list. There was so many more important things where lives have been lost, that lives have been stolen. Our mob have been murdered in these colonial structures due to faults that there were recommendations that have been sitting there gathering dust. There was no reason for Tanya Day to die in that cell on a concrete floor by herself. If that recommendation with that ridiculous public drunkenness, like, I can't, like, how can you even find the words to justify why we're losing our men, women, and children at the rate that we are to structures where recommendations already exist?
There's a point to make about that, I think, Leah, which is in relation to the case of Ms. Dew, for instance, over in Western Australia. While the coronial outcome of that was critical of individual practices, it made clear that no laws were broken during the course of dealing with her, no policies were not adhered to. And you watch the footage of that woman laying there dying while those charged with her care are having a yarn outside metres from her cell. And the only explanation for how she was treated is the R word, racism, that people are so scared of. But it is such a part of the reason why First Nations people are in the position that we are in, because you look at her situation, no laws were broken, nobody did anything wrong except refuse to treat her as a human being. And we need to come to grips with the role of racism in the place we occupy in the nation's heart and mind. And too often, even in that coronial process, the word racism was not used. And it was so obvious. It was described in all kinds of other ways, but there was ultimately a reluctance to name the behaviour for what it was, and it was racist behaviour. That's why she died. That's why she was ignored at hospital. It's why her pleas for help were ignored while she laid on the floor of a cell, dying. And that's a feature in the stark reality of the statistics. It has to be. Because when you take away postcodes, you take away geographical challenges, you take away mental health, you take away trauma, the one common feature in those statistics is our blackness. It's our Aboriginality, it's our indigeneity. That is the common feature across the board. And we have to come to grips with that. And we have to identify that we need to be in a position to influence the outcome of our lives.
And closely associated with that, and it's not an excuse, is unconscious bias. And that's, the issue that we've all got it. But what we can treat ourselves to address that unconscious bias. And I remember Dr. Pingu, who died in Darwin, the singer, and well, they're both singers, but where they just assumed that he was drunk when he had a chronic kidney issue that should have been addressed medically, but it wasn't. So they just put him in the cell, until it was beyond recovery. And we see that too often. That was Miss Day was the same situation. They just don't address it. So it's addressing unconscious bias, understanding that Sky News and all of these shock jocks aren't the answer to really getting an understanding of anybody or anything. Really studying hard and understanding. And I think reconciliation does play a role, and on bias I co-chair Reconciliation Australia. But what we do see now through the Narragansett program, which is an education program for schools, there's now over 8,000 schools and early childhood centres across the nation that are now teaching Aboriginal studies from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective. I think that our future and our young leaders, our young people now will be our leaders of the future, and they'll be much better positioned than some of our older politicians that are still got entrenched thinking from what they were taught, and they're not willing to unlearn some of those behaviours.
And the accountability for the systems like CYPS and the justice system, like if one of our mothers, if a child died under her watch, imagine the community, both black and white and Brindle, would be up and down. But when we lose babies within the care and protection system, and when we lose lives within the justice system, there's no accountability. No one really cares all that much. And that's the reality of it, because we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation now in 2022 if people cared about it. But the reality is that our mob, every minute of every day that come in contact with these systems, it is just taking their hand and leading them into an early grave. And that's the reality of it. And that's not dramatic when I say that. I'm not being dramatic when I say that. Our life expectancy, we've got the stats to prove that. But there's no accountability for these systems and these structures and the people in decision-making positions for our mob that are determining the trajectory of our lives, of our babies' lives. And I say that as a mother and as an auntie. These are our babies and they're our future. And what is the future for them if we continue down this pathway? And you can't help but sit back after you've watched that, but also in like just every day, feel as a worker on the ground, feel like the broader mainstream Australian community views black bodies and black lands, but I won't go down that because I've got a lot to say about that, but black bodies as disposable. And that, I don't say that to hurt anybody's feelings. I do say that to make people maybe reflect, because these conversations are uncomfortable, but they still need to be had. Why is it that that conscious or unconscious bias assists us to disregard black bodies in distress that are screaming and crying for help? Why are black bodies so disposable in Australia? And I say that after 2020, when, you know, we did see a massive show up for the Black Lives Matter movements across the country. And we did see some progress in that and people starting to pay attention. And especially with younger generations, a lot of younger mobs started saying this is ridiculous. But it took a black brother over in America to being murdered at the hands of police to get our attention here. When just years before that, David Dungay, last words, I can't breathe, experienced that exact reality, but no one gave a fuck about him. Why? And I think that's what we do need to leave here tonight and reflect on. Where were you when David Dungay's family were on the street marching? And I say this respectfully with their permission because I'm in regular contact with his sister, with his mother, Auntie Latona on the film, with Paul, his nephew, who, you know, made sure I had the badge on tonight. And I told him I wear my badge everywhere. And why did it take us having to consume all of that information that was from way over in America? And I'm not one for borders and all that. I think we're all here. It doesn't matter about these borders and all that at the end of the day. But when I stood there at that Black Lives Matter protest that we had in 2020, and I posed this question to everyone there that was there outraged over David Dungay, because we drew parallels to his murder with George Floyd. But no one in that audience really could say, when I said, who here actually knows when the last Aboriginal death in custody here in Canberra was? And I'll pose that question to everyone right now. If anyone can actually name the last black death in custody here. There you go. Thank you. And no, don't raise hands or nothing, but how many of you sit there and think, did you know that name? And did you know the tireless work that Winanga did behind the scenes for that young brother and his family? I wasn't done. So, you know, there's shit happening here in Canberra, but I think it's very easy to view it as a bit of a bubble and feel quite removed from these statistics unless you're on the ground seeing it day in, day out. But I'm rambling again. But yeah, you know, it is what it is.
We're running a bit short on time, but there's so much to say. No, I'm sorry. I guess to end my questions, the film's really meant to be a call to action for non-Indigenous people. We've got a lot of ANU students here in the audience. So I know you've touched on, you know, dismantling that unconscious bias that people have, but are there any other things you think people here who feel in the heaviness of the film can walk away with being like, I'm going to change in this way and I'm going to do my bit?
Get out of our way. That's cheeky and flippant, but the sentiment is a real one. If you're talking about us and you're looking around the room and not one of us is in the room with you, that's problematic, deeply problematic, and it's part of the reason why we're still sitting here talking about this. I mean, I've sort of harped on that as an issue, but I see it as one of the key factors of our inability to progress is the absence of us from the powerful tables. And we talk about allyship, and I often wonder how many folks would be willing to give up their position in that place of allyship to allow an Aboriginal person to occupy it. And it's a rare beast indeed. And whatever sectors you're in, whatever professions you're in, you need to look around yourself and ask yourself why we are not in the room. And not just as, and I don't mean this in a critical sense of the important work that people who occupy these roles do, but not just in supporting roles. We are more than liaison officers. We are more than administrative assistants. That's not to undermine the value of that work and the importance of that work in our communities across the board. But we are clever, capable, savvy people who know what our communities need and are capable of delivering it. The constraint is not capacity. The constraint is the capacity to allow us to drive the solutions for our people. And we need to be elevated and be allowed to elevate to those positions of power and influence. And true allyship, real allyship, is the promotion of us, not the promotion of yourself talking about us. And I think that's a really practical way that people can progress our interests.
Not much more I can say. That was well said. Just have a look at those reports and inquire about it. Understand human rights. ACT's got a good human rights bill. Federally, we don't have. And we need to push that agenda along. Understand what the big human rights advocate bodies are doing, and get behind them. But getting informed and creating the opportunities of partnership, of working together, addressing your unconscious biases, I think good starters.
I think there's so much more to be said. Oh, do you want to say
No, I'm
something?
not done.
Go for it.
No, because it's not often I have this many people listening to me. Uplift and support Black organisations, grassroots mob. We've got Wananga in the audience somewhere, and I saw Malcolm. Yeah, there's Julie, Beth. Malcolm's over here, Goog Garwin. We got some incredible mob on the ground doing the hard work, and they need to be respected, and so does the broader community in our capacity to strengthen ourselves and our families. Because I do tie it back to this contact with the justice system starts with the child removals, with the intergenerational trauma, with generation after generation of contact with these colonial structures that are inherently violent. How do you reform policing? It's an inherently violent institution. I don't have any answers. I see some incredible work over in America being done by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Davis. The blueprint's already there. So I'm excited to see how the younger generations adopt and adapt here in Australia, because I do see a lot of people starting to pay attention. And I think we are inherently not violent, but we are inherently critical thinkers. And I think that's one of the mob's biggest strength that has never been assimilated out of us. We are critical thinkers, and that is what drives us to continue to show up and fight this fight. Well, none of us have given up. We're all here still. All the mob that have been repeating themselves for generations are still here. We're tired, but we're still here showing up, trying to educate mainstream Australia. So like Lou said, just step aside, move, as Ludacris would say, and allow us to do what we need to do, because we hold those answers. We've already put them in reports. We've made recommendations. Let us do what we need to do. And so with the white saviour mentality that you as a non-Indigenous person can save us. We don't need to be saved. We need to be saved from your structures, if anything.
I think unfortunately that's all we've got time for tonight. But I want to yeah, sorry. Happy, yeah, okay. People are happy to stay. We can take some questions from the audience. I know we've got one at the back already. Mike will come over to you.
Okay, I'll stand up over you so the people at the back can see me. I'm a Wardai woman from Central Australia. I'm an Aranda Kadich woman, and education starts at home. Education starts at home, and in your household and in my household, we teach our kids manners. We teach them to respect others. What I've heard tonight, what we do is we have all these, what we call corporate blacks, who are sitting up in high places. I'd like to say thank you for all coming to see that. I've given evidence at Royal Commission. I challenged the manager at Don Dale, who threw that recommendation. He said, no, we don't take notice of that. And he threw it up on the mantelpiece. So a lot of money is being spent doing up all these reports. And to respect you, Mr. Calma, you're asking these people here to read the reports. What we need to do, I'm just making a suggestion. We saw how the police bully and torture our kids. We saw how young Dylan was thrown around. I know young Dylan and his mum. I'm a counsellor and a narrative therapist, and I'm also a trainer in assessed suicide intervention skills training. So I know what I'm talking about. And what we need to do is the people who have the power and the reconciliation, I'm not a very good speaker and use your language and whatever, but the social justice. We know what we want. We know. The problem is that we were born black. That's the problem. And we're walking down the street and we get picked on. I'm still writing a story around assimilation and integration. My sister used to do ACAP, Aboriginal Cultural Awareness. And she said, we had a discussion around where did we grew up? And I said, well, I like my happy days is down at the Gap Cottages. And she said, why? Because we were put in there through the assimilation. So that word kind of got stuck to me. And as a 60, I'll be 66 this year, I still can't understand it. So I want to read about it so I can teach my children and grandchildren. But we got to look at what the police are doing. We see what the police are doing to our kids. As an old ex-welfare worker back in the 80s, nothing has changed back in Alice Springs. I only just recently come back there. Nothing's changed. The people who are working like you, Mr. Calma, you can write all the reports and they're not going to listen to it. We're going to start looking at what the police are doing to our kids. Let's start charging them because they're doing it over and over and over and getting away with it. We're seeing it there. The welfare system in Northern Territory does not challenge them at all. As a Grandmothers Against Removal, which I am part of, we go there and we mouth off and bring out all the acts and your reports. But even those CEOs, they throw it away. So I'd like to see the police, they've built, from hearsay, they built prisons for bikies. Why don't they invest money in building prisons for these police officers? Because we can't have the police officers doing research or supporting whatever, because they're getting away with it all the time. As a worker on the street back in Alice Springs, back in the 1900s, not 1900s, but in 1974 or something, the police are talking to our young kids and saying, hey, like the thing, come and suck my dick. And one young girl said, hey, I know you, you're one of them officers that talked dirty with me last night. So they are getting away with it. And in the Northern Territory, we don't have anybody assessing our prisons. They busting at the seams. I've queried about, does anybody have, do anybody have power to go and assist in the prisons? Northern Territory is a state where they don't, it's a toxic state. And I make that known when I'm doing speeches uptown in Alice Springs as well. It's a toxic state. And it's not going to change. With all the report, with all the money being paid to people like you, Mr. Calma, you get a lot of money. You've been in that position for a long time. We need something different now, looking at what the police are doing to our kids. As an assist person, we said we need to get them to do the assist training. And the police up there, back in the 2000, they said, no, we don't need to get training. But they're the ones first on call. But they create those suicide as well, by chasing them. My grandson was supposed to meet his mother up at town to get a new pair of shoes. He was walking through the post office, and the policeman said, "Hey, come here, you little black C, C-U-N-T. I won't say the word. Come here, you little black C." And Lee kept walking. My grandson kept walking, and the police said, "Hey, you little black C, come here. Didn't you hear us?" And he said, "No, my mother and father named me Oliver. My name's not a black C." So education starts at home, and we teach our kids. And I've got 14 grandchildren, and I will always educate them about being black and we teach them not to run or anything like that, because they're human as well. Whatever. I can talk all the time. I can talk forever. But we're going to start getting away from those reports. You're spending a lot of money on that. On writing them reports. They tell you they throw it away. I'd like to come back to this forum and talk with the law students here. If I'm happy to come and talk and tell more stories. And because I want you to listen to what we're saying, because the grandmothers, and especially those mothers who've lost their children from deaths in custody, they need to come and express themselves as mothers. We can cry with them. If somebody died over in Western Australia, over in Queensland, we all cry because we're mothers, we're grandmothers, and we will always cry for them, even if we don't know them. But sir, please try and get away from writing those reports. Get into talking to because new election come, new people come, and they will just sit there and get fat. And we know that. And look what's happening in there now, what's been happening with that young Higgins girl, who I admire, But we've got to start looking at what the police are doing and getting away with it. And for your information, all you mob, have a look in the Northern Territory now, where the young Rolf boy is going through where he killed Kumanjay Walker. And have a look at that and see how racist that is. Thank you for listening.
Just a quick response. You might not appreciate reports, but find out who wrote the 2012 report on the Aboriginal Trust and on the suicide prevention strategy that got the funding for assist and thoroughly who you're working for. That came out of a report that I chaired into suicide prevention. So reports are important.
Our legislations, that's what needs to change for things to change. Everybody in like all these big flash jobs, it's easy for me to go, well, we need to change this and that. And then everybody go, no, but the legislation says this. We all need to stand together to change what's happening. But very rarely people on the ground really don't get taken much notice of. But for the legislation and everything to change, the people need to be heard. And the people in all the jobs need to actually stand behind them people. Because too many times, unfortunately, you go and deal with people and then they're like, oh yeah, bless them, you know. They're not really behind them. They're only behind them to a point. But then they're not going to push the point that much because they're more worried about their job. Comes a time that sometimes your job's not that important if you're worrying about wanting to change all that sort of shit. Thanks.
Is that Narelle? Sorry, I can't see. I must be blind, but I recognise the voice. That's the grassroots right there. She's been doing a lot of work with our mob that have been coming out of custody through a program called Culture Talks. That I think Shane was a part of that lodge, Shane Rattenbury. But she does a lot of work with mob coming out of custody, trying to keep them on track, trying to get them to do things. She does like making lots of deadly medicine and like bath bombs and that kind of stuff. But she does some deadly work in that space, trying to get mob to have something to do during the day so they're not sitting around bored. So yeah, that's another one up there. That's that grassroots level doing that practical work.
And that is the work I would give a plug for. That can only be done if properly funded. People shouldn't be expected to do this because they love it. I mean, yes, our community runs so often on the contribution of our people based on non-monetary reward. And for many of our people, our jobs are not 9 to 5, as you well know. But funding is required, proper long-term funding that's not at the whim of electoral cycles and 12-month contracts. It's impossible to affect change in 12 months in anyone's life, let alone a person who is deeply traumatised and struggling with comorbidities like drug addiction and mental health. So my plug around that work is it's incredibly important, but you've got to fund it. And it's a nonsense to expect our community to continue to do this for the love of it.
The appropriate funding, because the program that I was just talking about that Narelle's involved in, Culture Talks, when we created that back, I think in 2018 with Tanya Keed and Adam Shipp, that program has been operating for a few years now. Even through COVID, it's still hung in there. And then ACT government did try to swoop in and recreate and repackage and then resell what we had already created, and tried to sit us in a room and ask us for our thoughts on how we can make this operate when we've already been doing it, and maybe we could be appropriately funded so we can continue doing the deadly work that we're doing at a larger scale, instead of just putting us in a room and gathering our intellectual property, our IP, which is actually right now, we are freely handing over our intellectual property to everyone in this room right now. And then just to turn around and repackage and resell us our own ideas, and then make our organisations fight for tenders for that funding, just to pull it away 12 months later. It's a slap in the face to the mob on the ground doing the work, putting that energy in, which I think I already said, but yeah.
I reckon you don't need a microphone. Go for it.
I just wonder how many people here in this room really knows what happens here in the ACT, particularly for our mob around incarceration, the racial profiling from the police, the derogatory way that they interact with our people, the way that our people come into the justice system. You know, it's criminal. When we look at this, we're always looking at the Northern Territory, or we're looking at another state or territory. We're never looking in our own backyard. And for me, it's very, very distressing and very, very concerning that people are happy to go out there and, you know, sign a petition for what's happening in the Northern Territory. We have people dying out of prison and nobody gives us stuff. We had a young 27-year-old man die a couple of weeks ago. He wasn't Aboriginal, but he was a human being. You know, who cares? I do. And so do a lot of other people that I know. But I'm getting sick of it. I've got women writing to me, all the women from the jail, asking me to intervene on their behalf. I write to the minister and ask, can I go and visit women and talk to them about their concerns, being in isolation for 5 days, having a shower after day 3. Young woman self-harming a young Aboriginal woman. And the screws tell her to do a better job next time and then give her a raise blade at the end of the day. You know, like, this is real stuff that's happening in our prison. And who cares? And I really am. And I was knocked back. If the minister wanted to come with me, he could have come with me to speak to the women. But no good. When we got our clinic into the prison out there, we wanted to make a difference. And we still want to make a difference. But at every turn we get pushed back. Our clinic room is David Eastman's old cell. That's what they gave us for a clinic. And they gave the nurses a room over where the cottages were, where the pedophiles were. But now the women are back in those cottages. So how does that work? They didn't want to take a podiatry chair out of the room next door. They told us it was fixed and it wasn't. So we've had to fight for everything that we do in there. We went in there, we started doing yarning circles. They were all coming down, they were all engaged. They weren't in different cohorts. We go back 3 weeks later, they've changed the day, they've changed the time, and they've split the cohort. We set up rooms so that we could get access to our clients, even if, you know, they're in lockdown or we couldn't get them moved across the prison because there was no staff. Now we go to use them rooms and somebody else has got them. You know, it's just absolutely disgusting. We've got so many people in there with mental health issues. All the historical trauma. The mental health has created addictions. And then, you know, the sexual and physical violence in there is just out of control. Because for the last 2 years, all they've seen is lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. And we talk about people being perpetrators. Well, a lot of them men and women were victims before they were perpetrators.
And one regularly lost.
Absolutely. And they don't blame the magistrates and the judges. They blame the cops, you know, the DPP. You know, you've got good judges and magistrates there that actually want to do the right thing and give people lesser sentences, even after they take all their criminal history into account. Then you've got the DPP. 7 years isn't long enough. So they've got to take them back through the court and give them another 2 years. What's that? How do you rehabilitate people? Our community's grown to 9,000 now. And we've got cross-border issues with New South Wales. So them fellas are never free. They walk out of ANC, well, they don't even get to walk out of ANC. They're picked up, put in the back of the paddy wagon, taken to the courthouse. Then there's an extradition order to send them across the border. And even you, Lou, when you were the Deputy Commissioner of the Legal Aid Commission, when we had that 3-day-old baby removed, through no fault of the mother, we'd done everything right. And it was right on Easter. And we ended up in court because the mother of that baby, she never ever identified who the father was. But she was ostracised by association because at the time she'd been with a high profile criminal. And so they made a judgment. And she'd had children removed before. She engaged from Wollonga from the day she got pregnant. We let the child protection know. We did all the right things. It wasn't until that baby was born that child protection stepped in. And they called our midwives in the day that they were going to remove that baby and said, we're removing the baby at 3 o'clock this afternoon. So straight away we kicked into action. We went to the Legal Aid Commission, got hold of Louise, got their best family lawyer, and guess what? That baby went back to its mother. And that baby's still with that mother now, and that baby's now 4.5 years old. So if we hadn't intervened in that, that would have been another baby lost to the system. And this is my frustration.
And it's an excellent example, Julie, of the system not operating to protect that child and that mother. What protected that child and that mother is connections amongst mob, because formal processes didn't ensure that child was returned. What ensured that child was returned is that phone calls were made amongst concerned Aboriginal women that something terrible was about to happen. And it's an excellent example of how the experience of Aboriginal people was ignored and lost in the broader system.
And the thing was that, you know, I had staff that had already had plans for Easter. And my staff gave up their plans to go and stay in that government house with that mother and baby. And remember the donations, and child protection wanted to know where that lounge come from and where this come from. And my staff were there, the midwives and the social health people were actual staff. While they were there, child protection would come out every day. They checked the shower, they checked the rooms, they checked the bedroom to make sure there was no men there. And then we stayed there for 6 weeks because they only had one option, and that was to take the baby. Wollonga stayed there, unfunded, doing what we did for 6 weeks. And then they moved her to a refuge. But we never ever got any resources for that. They refused to fund us.
In fact, if you recall, you had to sign something saying that you wouldn't draw in any other service for resources.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know.
I can't speak to the specifics in terms of the cases you refer to, Julie, about the prison system, but what I can absolutely echo is the brutality of that system. And if the community think that there's much rehabilitation going on in prisons around the country, then they need to get a reality check, because they are unpleasant places. They are largely geared towards constraint and punishment. And my experience tells me that there is not a whole hell of a lot of rehabilitation going on.
And there's none, and there's no education of it. There's nothing. Officer out there. We're trying our best. We've got mental health nurse out there now. We're trying to do what we can. And I was hoping that Justice Health might step up and do the same, but all they want to do is drag us back. You know, I've got a couple of ministers here tonight. I wonder whether they'd let a TV crew go into the agency, or whether we'll get a royal commission into that place. Because it's the only way we're going to clean this place up is for the spotlight to be put on the ACT.
I think we've very much gone over time, but it's amazing. We're 45 minutes over. We're just having a yarn.
That was important because
Very
it really highlights those intersections with homelessness and being a single mother or being Aboriginal. Because I didn't even talk on those intersections, but that's really important because our services, where is like the services for our mob that identify in the LGBTQI plus cohort within ACT. We're not equipped in any of our services and building their capacity to work with a lot of these intersections. It's just mob on the ground doing the best they can, underfunded, at capacity. The job's not 9 to 5, and we're all exhausted. And I'm saying that I'm only 28 and I'm exhausted.
I think it's so important to have these spaces so we can hear what those grassroots are doing, which is amazing work. I know it's a lot of information to process that we've been given tonight, but I think there'll be some resources going out to everyone's email from Incarceration Nation. But I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who spoke from the audience, and especially our panelists today for giving us their wisdom, or a little bit of it at least, in the time we had. And I want to thank also everyone who's put this together. They've done amazing. Especially Saskia, Monica and Travis from the ANU LRSJ Indigenous Reconciliation Program. Amazing work. All volunteering. Also Professor Lorena Bartels, Associate Professor Anthony Hopkins, the ANU College of Law, Justice Reform Initiative, Documentary Australia, and that's just to name a few. So if we give them all a massive round of applause for putting on this event. And lastly, this is a free event, but as always, as Saskia said, donations are really welcome, and to all those grassroots places that are doing incredible work. But thank you for your attending, and thank you to everyone for being here today.
Thanks so much for inviting us. Yeah, how did we go with it's all we had up to